the world's most significant statue. Today, we're looking at the first two chapters of Daniel, where in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, it starts telling us about the events that took place when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, laid siege to Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Yehudah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, came to Jerusalem and sieged the city. And Yahweh handed over Jehoiakim, the king of Yehudah, over to him, along with some of the articles from the house of God. He took them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the articles in the storehouse of his God. Nebuchadnezzar also took away from Jerusalem 4 young men from the royal court of Jehoiakim. Among them was Daniel, who at that stage was around about 15 years old. The other 3 individuals were taken with Daniel were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then, verse 7, the chief officer gave them names. Daniel, he was to be called Belshazzar, and to Hananiah became Shadrach, and to Mishael became Meshach, and to Azariah became Abednego. Babylonian names are all we ever hear spoken by most people in the Christian churches, because they don't realize the meaning behind those Babylonian names. It is very interesting when we compare the meaning of the Hebrew names with the Babylonian alternatives. It is clear that the Hebrew names are related to Yahweh, while the Babylonian names are related to the Babylonian gods. As we see, Daniel is my judge. Belshazzar, conversely, is Bel protects the king. Hananiah, Yah has shown grace. Shadrach, the command of Uku. Mishael, who is what El is. Meshach, who is what Iku is. And Azariah, Yah is my helper. And Abednego is the servant of Nebu. Quite different, aren't they? It's quite a contrast. So regarding the life of Daniel, very little is known from the scriptures as to where he came from in his earlier life. And he never returned to Jerusalem, as far as we can gather. Instead, he lived out his whole life in the exile period. Following the conquest of Babylon by King Cyrus of Persia, he lived out the last of his days in the Persian Empire, finally dying as an old man in Shushan, the capital of Persia. We are not told how or when he died, but the last words to Daniel, the prophet, are spoken by the angel Gabriel in chapter 12, where it says, I heard this, but I couldn't understand what it meant. I asked, Lord, what will be the outcome of all this? But he said, go your way, Daniel. These words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end. Go your way until the end comes. Then you will rest and rise for your reward at the end of days. So many people ask, why should we concern ourselves with the life and times of Daniel the prophet when we are looking at the scriptures of the 21st century? What has Daniel got to do with the 21st century? What can he possibly teach us? The answer is that the prophets of the Tanakh told us much about history and how it was going to work out for Israel. But particularly Daniel, in the book of Daniel, it alone gives us a large glimpse at what is going to happen at the time of Yeshua's return. The key to Daniel is offered in chapter 12, verse 9, when Gabriel said to him, go your way, Daniel, for these words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end. So what Daniel was being shown in his vision is applicable to this very age in which we're now living. At no stage in history have the words ever applied the way they do today. That is why it is important for us to consider the book of Daniel alongside the book of Revelation. So beginning in chapter 1, we see that after being taken captive, Daniel, along with the other 3 boys, were being prepared for service in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. It appears the 4 boys were from, may well have been from the royal service of the king of Yehuda, or even related to the king. But the scriptures give us no specific details about their past. But Nebuchadnezzar was having them groomed for a life of administrative service in his royal court. However, in verse 8, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food and the wine that the king was drinking. He asked the chief officer if he could be excused from defiling himself with the king's food. By taking that action, Daniel was making a stand to remain kosher by not eating meats provided by the king, and he would not defile himself by drinking the king's wine, which of course involved toasting to the gods of Babylon. Chapter 1 ends with the words of Daniel. Daniel remained until the first year of King Koresh. That means he served as a succession of kings in Babylon right through the 70-year exile. That is one of the reasons why I believe there were 2 Daniels spoken about in the one book. The other Daniel is most likely a Cohen who entered the picture much later, at a time when the approval was finally given to complete the building of the second temple. We know from Daniel chapter 9 verse 1 that it was the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, that Daniel was the Cohen who was praying to Yahweh for guidance as to why, after such a long period, the temple had still not been completed. Now Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, began his reign in 423 BCE. That is 114 years after Yehuda had returned to Eretz Israel, which would have meant that Daniel the prophet, speaking in chapter 9, would have been 199 years old. So we can see from the age difference there must have been 2 Daniels in the book. Daniel the prophet and Daniel the Cohen. I'll explain that in more detail another time. But today I want to focus just on Daniel the prophet. So returning to chapter 2, we see that while Daniel the prophet was serving in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, and starting in verses 1 and 2, we are told, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the king became deeply troubled by a series of dreams that he couldn't sleep. The king ordered the magicians, exorcists, sorcerers, and astrologers, and summoned them to interpret the king's dreams. The magicians, the sorcerers, and the astrologers, who stood in the presence of the king, had no ability to explain what the king's dream meant, and let alone its interpretation. They proved beyond all shadow of doubt that the gods of Babylon were nothing more than worthless idols, just pieces of wood and stone. Their magic arts were simply trickery. And in this situation they failed completely. Even the adversary, who was a driving force behind the magical powers and trickery, along with the belief in the power and control over the natural world, was no help to any of these servants. So having been condemned to death for their failure, Daniel was told what was happening in the court in verse 13, that a decree had gone out and been published, all the sages were to be slain, which of course included Daniel and his companions. They also were to be put to death, even though they had not been asked to interpret the dream. But in verse 14, Daniel approached the captain of the royal guard and asked for a chance to interpret the king's dream. Such an approach was unheard of unless the king first asked the courtiers to be summoned. But before Daniel entered the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, he arranged for the other 3 boys to ask Yahweh, the God of heaven, for mercy and for the ability to reveal the secrets of the king's dream. At last, Yahweh gave Daniel not only the interpretation of the dream, but also the words that the king had actually seen in his dream. The answer came to Daniel in a vision at night. So in return, Daniel, in verses 20 through 23, gave Yahweh a blessed response of thanks and for the ability to spare not only his own life, but also the life of his companions and the fellow courtiers. All that led into one of the most powerful dreams that has ever been given by Yahweh, the God of heaven, to any human being. It was and still is vitally important that that dream and its interpretations be made known to Nebuchadnezzar and the sages of Babylon, and also to the rest of humanity, who, even those who have not yet lived or even been born in the 21st century, all need to know the outcome of this dream. So the effect of the dream will have an impact on all the nations. Now, which is why the dream and its interpretation are important for us to know. So having already read the words of Daniel in chapter 1 and 2 this morning, I want to focus on the significance of the whole statue dream and its relationship particularly to this modern age. But first, we must start by looking at the significance of the gold, silver, bronze, and iron, which represented the 4 mighty empires that have impacted upon Israel, and more particularly upon Jerusalem. As we now know, by looking back through history, the gold head of the statue represented Babylon itself, followed by the silver that Daniel in later chapters describes as the empire of Medo-Persia. Daniel also shows how the bronze in the statue represented Greece, starting with Alexander the Great and later with Antiochus Epiphanes, who desecrated the Second Temple in 167 BCE, and the capture and restoration of which, of course, ended up being celebrated by Hanukkah. Then the fourth metal, iron, is by far the most interesting of all the metals in the statue. Daniel, in later chapters, inquires deeply about the empire represented by the iron. It was different because it had 2 legs. The iron was known to represent the Roman Empire, but there were 2 legs that represented both Rome of the West and Rome of the East. Another unique feature of the Roman Empire is that unlike the other empires before it, the Roman Empire has never gone out of existence. Even though the Western leg morphed into the nations of the Western world, it has never been conquered or overthrown like the 3 empires of the gold, silver, and bronze. Similarly, the Eastern leg, centered at Constantinople, which we now know, of course, as Istanbul, as the capital of Turkey, has remained close to the Western alliances by being part of the Council of Europe. But as Turkey straddles the geopolitical boundary between the East and the West, it has a complex relationship with both the worlds of Christian Europe and the Muslim East. With Turkey itself being Muslim, it finds its relationship with Europe constantly strained as it dances between those 2 worlds. So having looked at the 4 main components of the statue, there still remains the feet and the toes, which Daniel saw as a mixture of iron and clay. Clearly, they could never become a metallic alloy. Finally, Daniel was able to tell Nebuchadnezzar the meaning of the strange mix of iron and clay in the feet and toes. He said in chapter 2, verses 40 to 43, where he was first considering the iron legs, and then focuses on the iron and clay mix. So starting in verse 40, it says, "The fourth kingdom will be strong as iron. The iron can break anything to pieces, pulverize it and crush it. So just as the iron can crush anything, this kingdom will break the other kingdoms into pieces and crush them." In verses 41 through 43, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You saw the feet and toes made of partly of pottery clay and partly of iron. This will be a divided kingdom, yet it will have the firmness of iron, since you saw the iron mixed with the clay from the ground. Just as the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. You saw the iron mixed with clay. That means that they will cement alliances by intermarriage. But they won't stick together any more than iron blends with clay." Even today, we see how Turkey is still trying to become an accepted member of the EU. But because Turkey is a Muslim, the Christian world would not accept Turkey into the Western Alliance. It is a clear indication that the two religious ideologies cannot blend, no matter how much they may try. Hence, the real unity between the iron and the clay is an impossible alloy. That brings us to the most important part of the dream, which is the event that is still to occur in the future. In the first part of verse 44, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will establish a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not pass into the hands of another person or people. It will break to pieces and consume all the kingdoms, but it too itself will stand forever." In the first part of verse 44, there appears to be a contradiction where it says, "In the days of those kings," where he says, where he is referring to the first three empires which Daniel had been told about. Remember, they were destroyed by the fourth. History shows clearly that Babylon, Medo-Persia and Greece were all destroyed by the Romans. But the first portion of verse 44 says that in the days of those kings, which implies that they're still present. So while it appears to be a contradiction, it is not, because we now know that the three empires are still part and represented through the United Nations. We are now living in an age when the first part of verse 44 will be fulfilled, as it continues to say, "The God of heaven will establish the kingdom that will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not pass into the hands of another people. It will break to pieces and consume all those kingdoms, but it itself will stand forever." Then in the second part of verse 44, Daniel says, "The stone that you saw, which without human hands separated itself from the mountain and broke to pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver and the gold, the great God has revealed to the king what will come about in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation is reliable. All the empires are to be completely shattered by that stone, which, as we know, of course, is Yeshua, who at his return will bring all the nations of the world to account for their collective and singular hatred through anti-Semitic attitudes towards Israel. Throughout the 2,600 plus years since Yahweh, the God of heaven, gave Nebuchadnezzar that dream, all the empires of the world, and latterly the individual nations, have all stood against both Israel and Jerusalem. All the nations of the world have acted under the umbrella of two great religious ideologies, namely Christianity and Islam. So it must come as no surprise that Yeshua, the Son of Man, when he returns, will destroy not only the two great religious ideologies, but also all the nations that are represented through the United Nations. The most regrettable thing that comes out of these 2 chapters of Daniel is that the nations of the world throughout the years since that dream was recorded have all failed to heed the message given to Nebuchadnezzar. That is why it is the most significant statute of history. As we see in verses 47 through 49, Daniel was respected and rewarded for revealing the meaning of the dream. More particularly, the king honoured the God of heaven, Yahweh, as being the God of gods. But by contrast, all the nations of the world who have evolved from those 4 empires in the statute have all turned their collective backs on the words of Daniel and joined forces to stand constantly against the people of Israel and subsequently against Yahweh, the God of heaven. We see that there is a very powerful message for the modern world wrapped up in those 2 chapters of Daniel, which will soon be brought to finality. So where do we stand in this age of world confusion? Are we standing with the God of heaven and speaking out in favour of the people of Israel? Or are we joining the greater part of the nations, pushing for the destruction of Israel and the people? The choice is ours. Throughout the 2 books of Daniel and Revelation, we can see clearly that what is happening through history and what will happen when the stone, Yeshua, strikes the statue of the nations. The outcome of that monumental event will be the total destruction of all national structures as we know them today, and Yeshua will remain and rule over the world until all humanity is given an understanding of God's sovereign plan. Then, finally, following the 1,000-year restoration, the final white throne judgment will bring about an end to it all, and those who stand with Yeshua will be led to the tree of eternal life. Shabbat Shalom.